The pine needles crunched under my boots as I carried the last box into my father's foyer. Arr. The house smelled of expensive cedar and the bitter chill of a failing furnace. My children hovered behind me, cut family dinner, clutching their coats while my father glared from the mahogany staircase. He did not offer a hand or a greeting. Instead, he spat the words like venom. Everything was peaceful until you showed up. I set the box down with a dull thud. Then my money is leaving with me. 5 minutes later, he was begging. The transformation was pathetic. Damned hitter. His arrogance evaporated as I gathered the kids and turned back toward the freezing sleet. He knew the mortgage payment rested in my handbag. He knew the heat stayed on only because I signed the checks. I watched his hands tremble against the banister. It was a familiar dance of dependency and resentment. I did not stay for the apology. I needed the crisp, honest air of the office. The real war was waiting. The boardroom at work tasted like recycled ego and cheap chemicals. It was exactly 72 degrees because I calibrated the sensors myself. Brad stood at the head of the table, vibrating with unearned confidence. He was the new vice president of strategic synergies. He did not look at me as I checked the electrical load on my tablet. To him, I was just background noise. He gestured wildly at a poorly formatted chart. He needed someone to blame for his own lack of preparation. Refill the toner? Secretary? Brad barked. His voice cracked through the quiet room like a cheap whip. He did not even turn his head. He just pointed a manicured finger at the printer. The other executives shifted in their chairs, staring at their polished shoes. They knew I was the facility director. They knew I held the master codes to every door and elevator. Brad was too new to understand the hierarchy. He thought the building regulated itself through the magic of positive thinking. I did not move. I simply stared at the back of his expensive, messy haircut. It was the kind of style that cost $300 and screamed of tax evasion. Did you hear me? He snapped, but finally spinning around. His eyes were wide and desperate. He needed a win before the Japanese investors arrived. I looked at my ID badge clipped to my belt. It clearly stated my title. To Brad, any woman over 40 without a blazer was just the help. The printer is network managed, Brad, I said. My voice was flat and cold. It is a formatting error. Your error. He blinked. His brain hitting the firewall of his narcissism. He did not care about the technicalities. He just wanted a servant to fix his mess. I felt a muscle twitch under my eye. This was the moment the suspension cable began to fray. I forced a smile that did not reach my eyes. It was the smile of a predator. The trap was set. I walked out of the boardroom, the glass door hissing shut behind my back. Brad's frantic shouting faded into a muffled hum. I did not go to the break room to fetch his sparkling water. Instead, I ducked into the janitor's closet and pulled the service panel hidden behind a mop sink. My industrial tablet glowed in the dim space. I brought up the building's master schematics. My heart hammered a slow rhythm against my ribs. I was no longer angry. The air in the closet smelled of pine cleaner and ozone. I looked at the temperature settings for room 404. I lowered the cooling set point by exactly 3 degrees. It was a subtle move designed to shrink Brad's unearned confidence. In my world, the things you do not see are the things that kill you. Black mold, carbon monoxide, or a woman with administrative access. I watched the status light flicker, from green to a steady, chilling blue. I finally returned with the glass of Perrier. Setting it down on a leather coaster. Brad ignored me, his eyes fixed on a slide deck. He took a sip without looking up and grimaced at the cold. The room had grown noticeably brisk. The other executives buttoned their blazers, sensing a shift they could not explain. I stood against the back wall, merging with the shadows of the mahogany panels. I was becoming one with the architecture now. About time, Brad muttered, his breath hitching. I offered a slight, mocking bow that he completely missed. You are quite welcome, Brad. I slipped out again, heading straight for the basement security hub. Mike was there, illuminated by the blue glare of 100 monitors. He was watching a grainy feed from 3 nights ago. The timestamp read midnight. Dinner. A woman in a sequin dress was stumbling out of the executive elevator. She definitely did not work here. Mike pointed at the log scrolling on the left screen. He is using the emergency admin override for his dates. My stomach did a slow roll at the blatant negligence. That code was reserved for fire marshals and bomb squads. It was not a key for a private motel. I leaned over Mike's shoulder, my eyes narrowing at the screen. Brad was leading the woman toward the server room. He was risking millions in data for a cheap thrill. Do I burn him now? Mike asked, his finger hovering over the save button. I shook my head slowly. Not yet. He will just spin it as a late-night audit. I needed something heavier than a lapse in judgment. I needed proof of the embezzlement Saul mentioned at the diner. I pulled up the badge history for the last 6 months. A red flag popped up on the screen. Brad had been accessing the restricted archives during the power dip. I realized then that Brad was not just reckless. He was systematically hunting for the same deeds I had already secured. Dinner. He knew about the dual legal entities. He was trying to find a way to sever the operational contract from the asset. If he succeeded, my ownership would vanish into a legal void. I looked at Mike, my face hardening in the dim light. He is looking for the poison pill. The hunter had officially become the hunted. I moved through the service tunnels, the air thick with the smell of old grease and cold iron. My objective was simple: reach the 12th floor before the demolition crew arrived. Brad had moved up the timeline. He was clearing out the tech startups tonight instead of Monday. I felt the building vibrate under my feet. It was a low, pained groan. He was killing the culture I had spent a decade building. The elevator groaned in sympathy, but I stepped into the hallway and nearly tripped over a pile of discarded monitors. The space was a graveyard of broken dreams. Sarah stood by the windows, her face pale in the flickering emergency light. She was clutching a box of files like a shield. Brad was standing over her, laughing into his phone. He looked like a man who enjoyed the weight of his own shadow. He did not see me yet. I was invisible. You have 10 minutes, sweetheart. Brad sneered, clicking his tongue. He did not even look at the girl. He was too busy admiring his own reflection in the glass. I stepped into the light, my heavy boots echoing against the concrete. Brad spun around, his smirk faltering for a second. He did not expect the help to show up after hours. I held my tablet tight. My knuckles were white. The pressure was rising in the hall. The lease says 30 days, Brad, I said. My voice was a low growl. He laughed. A wet sound that made my skin crawl. The lease says whatever I want it to say. He pulled a crumpled paper from his pocket. It was the forged asbestos report. I knew every inch of this floor. I had abated the pipes myself years ago. There was no dust here. Only lies. He was gambling with a felony. I moved closer. I have the original logs, I whispered. Brad's eyes widened, but then he regained his footing. He stepped into my personal space, smelling of expensive gin and desperation. Nobody cares about your logs, Paris. You are a glorified janitor. He reached out to shove my shoulder. I did not flinch. I just tapped a command on my screen. The lights on the entire floor went pitch black. The silence was sudden and heavy. He finally stopped laughing. In the darkness, I could hear his rag breathing. I had triggered the local lockout. Only my biometric scan could restore the power. You think you are in control? I asked. My voice seemed to come from the walls themselves. Brad fumbled for his phone. The screen, light casting garish shadows on his face. He looked terrified. He was a small man in a very large dark room. Then, a new sound echoed. A heavy thud. The service door at the end of the hall swung open. It was not Mike. It was a man in a tailored suit I did not recognize. He held a briefcase and a digital scanner. He looked at Brad, then at the darkened ceiling. The Delaware account is empty. Brad, the stranger said. My heart skipped a beat. Brad was not just embezzling from the building. He was being robbed by his own shell company. Family dinner. The trap had changed. Brad froze in the dim glow of his phone. The stranger from the hallway stepped forward, his leather shoes clicking on the concrete floor. Who are you? Brad stammered, his voice thin and cracking. The man ignored him and looked at me. He held up a digital scanner that pulsed with a faint red light. My pulse quickened as I realized he was not a lawyer. He was a professional forensic auditor. Someone else was already hunting Brad. The auditor gestured toward the server room door. The Apex Solutions account was drained 10 minutes ago. Brad's face turned a sickly shade of gray. He looked at his phone as if it had betrayed him. I realized my objective had shifted instantly. I needed to secure the server room before the data vanished. If the auditor took the drives, my leverage over the building disappeared. I tapped my tablet, but the screen stayed stubbornly dark. The air grew thick with the smell of hot copper. Brad lunged for the server room door, his desperation palpable. I blocked his path with a heavy shoulder. He stumbled back, cursing under his breath. The auditor did not move to help. He just watched us like a scientist observing a dying insect. The encryption is resetting, the man said calmly. I felt the heat rising from the floor. The cooling fans had stopped spinning entirely. I shoved past Brad and punched my master code into the server room keypad. The lock buzzed but refused to disengage. Brad laughed. A jagged and frantic sound. I changed the hardware protocols, Paris. He looked at the auditor with a manic grin. He thought he still had a card to play. I reached into my tool belt and pulled out my heavy-duty override key. But last night at family dinner, the building groaned as the internal temperature continued to climb. The server racks began to scream with a high-pitched whine. We were seconds away from a catastrophic hardware failure. I jammed the key into the manual override slot and twisted hard. Enter. Metal ground against metal with a sickening screech. The door finally clicked open. A wave of heat hit me like a physical blow. The blue lights of the racks were turning an angry, pulsing red. The data was literally melting in front of our eyes. I ignored the heat and grabbed the main backup drive. My fingers burned as I yanked the housing free. Brad tried to grab my arm, but I swung the heavy drive like a hammer. He ducked, his eyes wide with genuine terror. The auditor stepped into the room, his scanner glowing bright. "You are interfering with a federal investigation," he warned. I did not care about his rules. I only cared about the soul of my building. I shoved the drive into my bag and turned toward the service exit. Thinner. Auditor was already reaching for his radio. Brad was curled on the floor, clutching his stomach and gasping for air. I realized then that the stranger was not just an auditor. He was working for the Japanese investors. They had been tracking the money long before I bought the contract. I ran for the stairs as the fire alarms began to wail. I sprinted down the narrow concrete stairwell, the heavy backup drive thumping against my ribs. The fire alarm continued its rhythmic, piercing shriek. My lungs burned with the metallic tang of overheated hardware and dust. My objective was simple. I had to reach the basement command center to upload the encrypted data before the auditor cut my access. I could hear heavy footsteps echoing from 3 flights above. The stranger was not giving up his prize easily. I felt the building's heat rising through the walls. The air in the lower levels felt thick and stagnant. I reached the service door for the basement, but it was deadlocked from the inside. I punched my override code, but the keypad flashed a defiant red. Brad had locked me out of my own sanctuary. I looked at the manual release lever, but it was jammed with a steel bolt. This was not a system glitch. It was a deliberate act of sabotage to keep me trapped. The heat was becoming unbearable. I pulled a heavy pipe wrench from my tool belt. I slammed the tool against the steel bolt until sparks showered the floor. With one final grunt, the metal snapped. I shoved the door open and tumbled into the command center. Mike was gone. Tit family dinner. His chair was overturned and his monitors were smashed into jagged glass shards. A frantic scrawl on a notepad read, "They're coming for the hub. I'm drawing them away." I realized then that I was completely alone in the heart of the beast. I called. The silence in the room was heavier than the alarm outside. I scrambled to the main terminal, ignoring the broken glass. But last night at family dinner, because I plugged the backup drive into the secondary port, I needed the logic bomb to deploy before the federal protocols took over. A progress bar appeared on the screen, crawling forward with agonizing slowness. I looked at the security feed for the lobby. Dinner. The Japanese investors had arrived early. They were standing in the cold light of the entrance, looking at their watches. Time was running out. Suddenly, the monitor flickered to life. A video feed from the boardroom appeared. Brad was there, smoothing his hair and adjusting his silk tie. Dinner. He looked untouched by the chaos on the 12th floor. He was smiling at the empty chairs, practicing his pitch for the merger. But last night at family dinner, I realized he had moved the meeting up to hide the evidence of the fire. He was going to sell a burning building to the highest bidder. My progress bar hit 50%. I heard the heavy door behind me creak open. I did not turn around. I thought it was the auditor. But the shuffle was too heavy, too familiar. I kept my eyes on the screen as the data surged into the network. "You shouldn't have come back." Paris. A familiar voice whispered. It was not the auditor. It was my father. He was standing in the shadows, holding a master key I thought I had destroyed years ago. He looked at the screen with a mixture of greed and regret. He was working with Brad. He had provided the physical master key to bypass the hub's security, the one thing my digital layers couldn't block. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. My own blood had sold the building's secrets to the man trying to destroy it. My father stepped into the light, his face a mask of false sympathy. "We can fix this, honey. Just give me the drive." I looked at the progress bar as it reached 99%. The logic bomb was live. I realized the merger was not just a deal. It was a setup for a much larger theft. Brad had more allies. My father's shadow stretched across the broken glass, like a stain. I kept my hand on the terminal, feeling the hum of the final upload. The progress bar hit 100% with a soft, digital chime. I had successfully deployed the logic bomb into the building's core. "You sold me out for a mortgage payment?" I said. My voice was steady, but my heart felt like it was breaking. He did not deny it. He just looked at the heavy backup drive. "Brad promised a percentage of the merger," he whispered. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the shards. I realized he was not just a victim of greed. He was a willing participant in the sabotage. He reached for the drive, his eyes fixed on the blinking blue light. I pulled it back, my knuckles white against the casing. The room felt smaller as the air filtration died. The silence of the basement was becoming a suffocating weight. I was truly alone. The logic bomb began its silent work within the network. Above us, the building began to respond to the new commands. But last night at family dinner, lights on the 40th floor would be flickering in a coded sequence now. I needed to reach the boardroom to finish the job. My father blocked the only exit with his wary, heavy frame. He was not a strong man, but he was desperate. Desperation is often more dangerous than skill. I looked for a way around him. I saw the wrench. "Move, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a low growl. He shook his head slowly, his face a mask of regret. "I can't let you ruin this for us." "Paris." He lunged forward, surprisingly fast for his age. I dodged his grasp and shoved the backup drive into my bag. I grabbed the heavy pipe wrench from the table. I did not want to hurt him, but I would not let him stop me. Dinner. The building groaned as the elevator power began to fluctuate. The lights in the command center turned a deep, warning red. The logic bomb was triggering the emergency lockdown protocols. I shoved past my father, using my shoulder to force him aside. He stumbled into a rack of servers, gasping as the air grew thin. I did not look back. I ran toward the freight elevator, the only lift still operational. My fingers fumbled with the manual controls as the floor began to vibrate. I had to reach the boardroom before Brad signed. The elevator ride was a slow, mechanical torture. Every floor I passed felt like a second lost in the race. I watched the floor indicator crawl toward 40. The logic bomb was designed to lock the boardroom doors. Once the merger started, I needed to be inside when the trap snapped shut. The drive in my bag was heavy with the proof of their crimes. I could smell the ozone and the burning wires. The building was screaming in its own digital way. The doors opened on the 14th floor with a sharp ding. The hallway was eerily quiet. The lights dimmed to a golden glow. I saw the Japanese investors entering the boardroom at the far end. Brad was there, greeting them with a fake wide smile. He looked like a king about to claim his crown. He did not see me lurking in the shadows of the alcove. I waited for Mr. Tanaka to take his seat at the table. Suddenly, a hand clamped over my mouth from behind. I tasted salt and the scent of expensive leather. It was the auditor from the 12th floor. He dragged me back into the service closet, his grip like iron. Stay quiet. He hissed into my ear. I struggled against him, but he was far stronger than my father. He pulled a badge from his jacket. It was not a federal ID. It was a private security firm. He was working for Tanaka. I stopped fighting as the realization hit me like a physical blow. The Japanese investors were not walking into a trap. They were the ones setting it. Tanaka had hired the auditor to find the fraud before the money moved. I looked at the man, my eyes wide in the dark. He knows, I whispered. The auditor nodded once, his face grim. He knows everything. Just needs the drive you are holding to prove it in court. We heard the heavy boardroom doors click shut. The logic bomb had executed its final command, sealing everyone inside the room. I felt the pressure in the hallway change as the ventilation stopped. Brad was trapped with the very people he was trying to rob. I looked at the auditor and handed him the backup drive. My objective had changed again. I needed to be the witness, not the executioner. We stepped out of the closet and toward the sealed door. The auditor and I stood before the sealed boardroom doors. The logic bomb had engaged the magnetic locks with a final, heavy clunk. Inside, the muffled sound of Brad's voice continued. He was still oblivious to the digital cage I had built around him. My objective was to enter the room and deliver the killing blow to his career. The auditor adjusted his grip on the backup drive. He looked at me with a nod that signaled the end of our silent truce. I snide at family dinner. I swiped my master tablet over the biometric scanner. The light flashed yellow, then red. Brad had completely overwritten the local permissions. The pressure in the hallway spiked as the air handlers groaned above us. He was trying to suffocate the system to hide his tracks. I realized I could not get in through the front. I looked toward the ceiling plenum. There was one way left into that room. Heather? I had to go through the interstitial void. I climbed the maintenance ladder with shaky hands. The auditor followed me, his leather shoes scraping against the rungs. We crawled through the narrow space above the ceiling tiles. The air here was hot and smelled of old fiberglass. I moved toward the vent grill directly over the head of the table. I could see Brad through the slats. He was sweating through his silk suit. He was holding a pen over the merger documents. Mr. Tanaka was watching him. Just sign here, Brad urged, his voice thin and desperate. Mr. Tanaka did not move. He looked up at the ceiling, his eyes locking onto the vent. I realized he knew I was there. The silence in the room was chilling. The Japanese investors were not waiting for the papers. They were waiting for me. I felt the heat from the server fires below rising through the ducts. The logic bomb had disabled the fire dampers, letting the scorching air from the basement reach the executive level. I kicked the vent grill hard. It fell with a loud crash. I dropped onto the mahogany table, glass and dust scattering everywhere. Brad shrieked, stumbling back into his chair. I stood up, my heavy boots leaving scuff marks on the polished wood. I was covered in soot and grime, but I had never felt more powerful. The auditor dropped down behind me, holding the backup drive like a weapon. The room went silent. Brad looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. He realized his secret was out. This woman is a trespasser, Brad yelled, his face turning purple. Security. Get her out now. No one moved. Mike stepped from the shadows behind Mr. Tanaka, eyed Revere. He was bruised, and his uniform was torn from his earlier fight to draw the saboteurs away, but he was smiling. He held a tablet that mirrored my own. The building has a new operator, Brad, Mike said. I looked at the investors. Mr. Tanaka stood up slowly and bowed to me. He was not surprised by my dramatic entrance. I pulled the master key from my pocket. I set it on the table between the merger documents. The deal is dead, Brad, I said. My voice was cold and sharp. Brad reached for the papers. But the auditor grabbed his wrist. The man showed his private security credentials to the room. Apex Solutions is under investigation for fraud, the auditor stated. Brad's jaw dropped. He looked at the screen on the wall. It was playing his crimes. The video of the server room test played in high definition. Then, the email chain regarding the kickbacks appeared. Brad scrambled to find a way to explain it away. It is a deepfake? He screamed. She is a disgruntled secretary. I stepped off the table and walked toward him. I felt the weight of every insult he had ever thrown at me. I was the architect of his downfall. I looked him in the eye and smiled. I am the owner of Titan Infrastructure, I whispered. The words hit him like a physical blow. He slumped into the chair. His unearned confidence finally shattered. Mr. Tanaka picked up the pen Brad had dropped. He did not sign the merger. Instead, he signed a direct oversight contract with my company. Brad realized he was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. The room felt cold as the emergency cooling finally kicked in. The magnetic locks on the doors hissed open. The police were waiting in the hallway. I watched them handcuff Brad and lead him away. He did not look like a king anymore. He looked like a small, broken man. I turned to see my father standing in the doorway. He looked at me with a mixture of shame and fear. I realized the war was over, but the wreckage remained. I still had one last secret to face. I stood in the silent boardroom as the police led Brad away. The high rise felt hollow now. Its internal systems finally settling into a steady hum. My father remained by the threshold, his face a map of regret and spent pride. I walked toward him, with the heavy backup drive still clutched in my hand. He looked at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. I had to do it. Paris, he whispered. I simply placed the office keys in his palm. The weight of the last hour pressed against my chest. I had saved the building. But the family. Bridge was a pile of ash. My father looked at the brass keys, and then back at me. He realized they were not for the executive suite. They were for the small storage unit, where his old belongings gathered dust. I was not offering a reconciliation. I was providing an exit. He turned slowly and walked toward the freight elevator. He was finally leaving. I turned back to Mr. Tanaka, who was quietly observing the exchange. He did not judge or interfere. He simply waited for the professional to return. The 12th floor will be restored by Monday, I promised. He nodded and offered a rare, thin smile. The partnership was solid now, built on the cold reality of shared interests. I checked my tablet one last time to ensure the fire suppression systems were resetting. Dinner. The structural integrity of the asset was intact. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. The cold glass felt soothing against my forehead. I had spent years believing my value was tied to the titles Brad used as weapons. I thought I needed a blazer to be heard. Now, the building breathed because I willed it. The lie had dissolved into a sharp, undeniable truth. Dinner. I did not need their permission to lead. I was the architect of my own quiet, steel kingdom. The hallway was empty as I headed toward the lobby. Sarah was waiting by the entrance, her eyes wide with cautious hope. I handed her the new lease agreement. It was signed and notarized with the Titan infrastructure seal. She did not say anything. She just gripped the paper and exhaled a breath she had been holding for days. I felt a surge of genuine peace. The right people were back in their homes. The virus was gone. I stepped out into the crisp night air. The children were waiting in the car, but their faces pressed against the window. I realized I had one more task before the night ended. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. But last single message from a hidden number blinked on the screen. It was a secondary Delaware account. It was not empty. Her name was at the top of the transaction logs I had just recovered. She hadn't just helped my father steal the key. She had built the Delaware shell company herself. Brad had a partner I had never even considered. My mother was the one on the other end of the transaction,